Hello, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance and welcome to my 5.4 second half Abyss pre-guide. If you're seeing this, I'm probably on vacation right now, so I wasn't actually able to test the current Abyss, but I do know the enemies we'll face, so we'll still run through all the mechanics. I just won't have as much detail about spawn locations, grouping, different qualities of enemies in the Abyss, or being able to do a lot of thorough testing. Though don't think I haven't done a lot of testing on the enemies already, this guide is packed full of useful information, and I will do a second follow-up video in about 10 days with all that missing information, including testing of Aeon Sun and Varessa, so subscribe if you don't want to miss that. This video is also specifically for Floor 12, but I do plan to make a Floor 11 video, albeit later. Just like every Abyss these days, we're breaking HP records again. This time, it's with 12-3. So after last Abyss, we're back to the expected difficulty of Abysses again. As always, if you have any thoughts, tips, advice, criticisms, feel free to put them in the comments below, and any missing information or incorrect notes will be pinned. Okay, let's get into the general tips that I do for every single Abyss. If you're just looking to squeeze out a little bit more to get those 36 stars, this might be helpful to you. So first of all, think about non-continuous runs. Non-continuous runs are where you get 3 stars in one chamber, but not necessarily the rest of the chambers. And on a different run, you get the 3 stars for the rest of the chamber. This is because you don't need to get all 9 stars in one run to get all of the rewards. So then you can take teams that are really good at one chamber in particular, but not necessarily the rest of them. Enemy practice: if you don't know how an enemy works, or you're not completely confident fighting against them, you can always go fight them in the overworld. This is particularly apparent for this guide because that's what I had to do for a lot of the enemies. I had to work out things against them in the overworld. There are sometimes some small differences. Enemies might be hard in the Abyss, but it's still a good testing ground to get an understanding of an enemy. Abyss cards, or Benediction of the Abyss. At the start of each chamber, you're given a selection of 3 cards. These can give you quite useful buffs, from crit damage to HP to elemental mastery to attack. But at the same time, some of the buffs might not be at all useful for the team you're taking. Luckily, these options change daily. And so if you're halfway through a run, you get to a chamber and it gives you terrible cards, like you're running Mualani and it gives you all defense options. You can wait for the next day, continue from the chamber that you paused at, and pick different cards, and maybe this time it gives you crit, elemental mastery, and HP, which are all really useful stats for Mualani. Lastly, because of a comment someone put on my last video, I thought I should also mention the Imaginarium Theatre buffs. The Imaginarium Theatre buffs for the 6 selected characters that you're forced to take at the start of it apply not only to Imaginarium Theatre, but also the Overworld and Abyss. So if you can take those characters, keep in mind that they will get a bit of a boost. Right, let's get into things. Firstly, the Abyss busing. As usual, it's a shockwave of true damage around your character's location. You can trigger every 3 seconds, and to do so, you need to do a plunge attack. Teams with Xiao, Varessa, Garming, Xianyun, Diluc can all make good use of this, but as usual, the more in-depth team recommendations are at the end of the video. Again, we have leyline disorders, so let's take a look at them. For the first half, we have the damage of Hydro Elemental skills increased by 75%. This is obviously very good for Farina and can be used for Jincho, though characters like Mualani and Ayato, even though you need to level their skill for the damage that they do is normal attack or charge attack damage and not actually skill damage, so this won't help them. And on the second half, we have a buff that directly complements the Abyss Blessing, which is simply characters' plunging attacks are increased by 75% damage. As usual, for both of the lane line disorders, this 75% bonus isn't directly 1.75 times the damage that you do, but instead it's combining that with all of your damage buffs and your goblets. So while still being very significant, it's not quite as crazy as it might seem. Okay, let's take a look at the individual chambers. The general tips for this are, first of all, that it's mainly single target content. There's only one time you'll be fighting 2 enemies at once. And to some degree, it's multi-wave content. You are facing multiple waves of enemies in both of the chambers. Admittedly, it's only 3 then 2 waves. As always, keep in mind recommendations can be worked around with enough damage, but requirements are a lot more strict, and suggestions won't improve your time cost but might make combat easier. So let's look at the general advice for side 1 specifically. I wouldn't necessarily rely on geo damage exclusively, but as it's only a single enemy, it shouldn't be too impactful if you do, as the first enemy has really high geo resistance. On top of that, the first enemy has a mechanic where you can bring Osea, Pneuma, blunt damage, say with a claymore, or Geo to break its shield. You absolutely need to take some kind of Hydro, Electro, Anemo, or something to be able to break the Pyrolector's ward, and the same goes for the Electrolector. You need to bring Pyro, Dendro, Cryo, Anemo, or something to be able to deal with its ward. A quick note here is when I talk about a ward, that's simply a barrier on an enemy, whether that's elemental or damage-wise. When I talk about a shield, that's a barrier on your character. For the last enemy as part of Chamber 1, you don't want to rely on Pyro damage because it has really high Pyro resistance, But as it's only one enemy, again it's less significant. For the main mechanic of that enemy, you can also bring night solar line damage, as that will get more of a boost to it. And lastly, bringing some Hydro, Electro, or some way to deal with a Pyro Elemental ward for the YOB if you can't break its white shield can be advisable. Okay, so that's a general advice for the team building, but let's take a look at the enemies individually. So first we have the Breacher Primus Shatterstone. This has much higher geo resistance, all the way up to 50%. At the start of the chamber, it will create a geo elemental ward consisting of 6 units. While it has the ward, its attacks will be more dangerous, and you can destroy this ward in quite a number of ways. First of all, simply using blunt damage, which is say something like a claymore, to break it. Any application of Osir or Numa, so any character from Fontaine, can instantly disable this ward, or any geo application, so a Zhongli skill instantly breaks this. After you break the ward, it will become paralyzed for 15 seconds. Paralyzed simply means it won't be doing any attacks or moving anywhere. Though keep in mind that breaking this ward only makes its attacks less deadly and doesn't actually make you do any more damage. You'll do the same damage whether it has this ward up or not. To this, we're facing 2 enemies we haven't seen in a while, which are 2 Abyss Lectors, Pyro and an Electro one. Abyss Lectors always have 2 stages to them. First, you deplete their health bar to 20%, then they become immune for a little while and summon a ward. Second, you deplete their wards, and once their wards are broken, then they're defeated. The Pyro and the Electro Lectors work a bit differently, so I'll explain them individually. First, the Abyss Lector Fathomless Flames. This Lector has a ward worth 72 units of Pyro. This means you need 72 applications of Electro or 36 applications of Hydro, because Hydro removes 2 units. When they hit you with their attacks, they can put brands on the character when they take damage, which then causes your whole party to take damage. After it's created its ward, one of the attacks will summon a meteor, and when this meteor lands and crashes, it creates a Dark Furnace. This Dark Furnace is simply a Pyro ward of 6 elemental units. When you break it, it depletes 12 units of the Pyro Lector's ward. So if you have a character that's able to hit both of these at the same time, that's great, but if not, focus down the Furnace first. Okay, let's take a look at the Electro Lector, known as Violet Lightning. The Electro Lector's ward is half as big as the Pyro Lector's, consisting of only 36 units. This means, again, you need 36 applications of Pyro, Dendro, or Cryo. This is because you don't have something like Hydro that was able to remove double the amount. Hydro this time only removes about 0.4. Some of its attacks, specifically when it's summoning Electro-looking orbs, can drain energy off your characters. If you're reliant on your bursts in any way, it's important to dodge these. So that's the enemies individually, but we're fighting them together, so what's going to be the best way of dealing with their wards? Swirling can be super useful against these enemies, as applying Electro to the Pyro Lector and vice versa is very effective at breaking the elemental wards. So keep in mind, if you're swirling evenly, you'll always break the Electro Lector's ward first, because the Pyro Lector's ward is double the size, and Pyro and Electro is only going to remove 1 unit from each. Something else that's important to know for Anemo characters is about absorption priority. When Kazuha's using his burst or skill, the element that's absorbed by them changes depending on the elements available. So for in this case, because you have a Pyro and an Electro enemy, Kazuha will always end up absorbing one element with those abilities over the other. In this case, it's Pyro over Electro, which means if you're relying on an Anemo character to break the wards, it's even more likely that you'll break the Electro Lector's ward before the Pyro Lector's. On top of that, while we're here, I should also probably explain kind of how you break the ward, because it's not just every single hit of an element that breaks them. It really comes down to how fast you can apply an element. And so there's 2 important factors you need to consider when looking at breaking elemental shields. 1, how much of an element a character applies, and 2, how often a character can apply an element. Usually, you can expect most characters to apply a single unit of an element with their ability. For example, Barbara's attacks, whether it's her charge attack or her normal attack, will only apply 1 unit of Hydro to an enemy, which means it would remove 2 units of a Pyro ward. On the other hand, Child's Burst applies 2 units of Hydro. This means it would then remove 4 units of a Pyro ward. I've added a link to the Genshin wiki, so if you want to look at how much of an element characters apply, you can find that out. But as I mentioned, the other important stat to look at is how often characters can apply an element. Xiangling is famous for having no ICD on her burst, but did you know that ICD stands for internal cooldown? Internal cooldown means how often a character can apply an element, and Xiangling has no ICD, so she has no internal cooldown. That means every single hit of her burst is applying Pyro. The usual rules around how often a character is able to apply an element comes down to either every 2.5 seconds or every 3 hits, and those 3 hits are usually counted individually per ability per character. But it's common for things like skills and bursts, things that have just one instance of damage, to have no ICD. On the other hand, a character like Fischl with her Oz that fires projectiles really often can have lower ICD. For Fischl, Oz only applies Electro every 1 in 4 hit. But let's look at a common example with a character like Yoimiya. If I do one attack with Yoimiya, it applies Pyro. If I wait 2.5 seconds and do another attack, that's also applying Pyro, because of the 2.5 second rule. So if I do one attack and a second attack before the 2.5 seconds is up, that second attack isn't applying any Pyro. But if I do another after that time limit, it will apply Pyro. See, if I do 4 attacks within 2.5 seconds, the first and the fourth attack will apply Pyro because of the 3-hit rule. And then if I do another attack after the 2.5 seconds, it will also apply Pyro because of the 2.5 second rule. So they kind of work at the same time. Of course, this can get quite complicated, as these things aren't listed in the game anywhere. This was only found through rigorous testing and these days data mining. So I've added another link below to the Genshin wiki showing how often per ability a character applies an element. Though it can be sometimes useful to look at if you want the nitty gritty, but realistically you can just pick characters of the opposing element to the wards that the enemies have, and you should probably be okay. Now that hopefully you've got an idea of how elemental application works and you can break those wards, let's look at the last enemy of the first half. We did face a Cryo Wild previously in 5.3, and they work in pretty much the same way. The main difference being that this one has 50% pyro resistance. Just like the previously met Cryo Wild, after a short moment of about 5 seconds, it will create an area around itself that constantly drains your whole party's energy, and at the same time it will create a ward on itself. Some important notes to know for this are that first of all, Mawika doesn't use energy for her burst, so that's not effective. As you do have that brief period of 5 seconds at the start, it's important for characters like Zhangling or ones that are really reliant on their burst to cast them before that energy draining mechanic starts, whether that's in those first 5 seconds or previously even when you were facing the Lector. Though you can stall out this zone being created by either staggering it continuously or freezing it. Though if you do this, it's likely that after that state of being staggered or frozen ends, it will try to create the area again. You should also ideally be within this area, because while you're in the area, you get a large boost to your damage of 120%. That's like 3 gobblers worth. And then on top of that, characters that are doing nice soul damage get an extra 60%. And taking a look at the white ward specifically, it's just a damage ward like you might see against a Valin. The ward itself is about 112% of its max HP, and this ward can't take extra damage from amplifying reaction, so melt or vaporize won't increase your damage at all. Alongside that, it can't be petrified by Zhongli or frozen while it's got its ward up. In the worst case scenario, you don't manage to break the white ward within the time, it will summon a pyro elemental ward for a maximum of 48 units. This scales depending on how much of the white ward remains. So if there's only 50% of the white ward left, the ward will only be half as big, so 24 pyro units instead of 48. Though if you do manage to break the white ward in time before the mechanic is over, you will be refunded a huge amount of energy particles that will likely restore all of your character's bursts. And just like regular energy particles, the character that catches these particles will get more energy back from the rest of the characters. Should I say more value from it? You get the idea. Lastly, when you break either the white or the pyro ward, it will then be paralyzed for 5 seconds. And that's it. Okay, let's take a look at side 2. So the general tips for side 2 are don't rely on dendro damage as your main source of damage, as there's a boss with a really high dendro resistance. You'll also ideally like to bring electro for the mechanic and probably not pyro. Firstly, you're facing the Eremite Floral Ring Dancer. This is part of a human faction, so it has minus 20% physical resistance. As soon as you enter the chamber, they will summon a Spirit of Omen Dendro Spirit Serpent. The summon has minus 50% dendro resistance, so it's really vulnerable to dendro damage, and it has about 30% of the health of the Floral Dancer themselves. When you defeat the spirit, it will do 37.5% of the Floral Dancer's current HP. And while the serpent is summoned, the Floral Dancer themselves will gain 50% resistance to all types of damage, so you should focus the serpent when you can, unless the Floral Dancer is already really low HP, in which case it might not be worth focusing down the serpent, as this only does damage based on her current HP, not her max HP. After defeating the serpent, she'll not only take the aforementioned damage, but she'll also be paralyzed for 10 seconds, losing all of those gained resistances she had. Further than that, her dendro resistance gets an even further decrease, going all the way to minus 50. So you might think, oh great, I can do extra dendro damage to her, and her serpent has really low dendro resistance, maybe I should take dendro damage. Well, unfortunately, they added another enemy in this chamber, the Jade Plume Terrashroom that I want to talk about next, that has really high dendro resistance. They have 80 dendro resistance while only having 25 to the rest of the elements. So dendro damage isn't actually that great for this chamber. There is one main mechanic for the Jade Plume Terrashroom, which is if you hit it with electro attacks or an electro dendro reaction, it fills up its fury meter, which when full causes the Terrashroom to become activated. When activated, it will perform an especially aggressive attack before tiring itself out and becoming paralyzed for 15 seconds and losing 25% resistance to all types of damage. So ideally you bring some Electro because this really does help you do a lot more damage to the enemy. On top of that, in a lot of its attacks, it applies Dendro to itself, meaning you only need to bring Electro to get that Fury meter up. Once it is activated, some of those attacks can be quite deadly, especially the rapid Pex attack, so just be wary of that. The other thing to note for that is that if you apply any Pyro to it, it will decrease the Fury bar, meaning it's harder to get it to activate and reduce its resistances. If you do apply Pyro to it, it will then try to shrug it off, doing an attack where it summons 3 floating Dendro fungi, and up to 4 can be summoned at a time. But hopefully you defeat it and we move on to Chamber 2. The general tips again for Chamber 2 are single target. Side 1 is really quite simple. We're facing 3 Ruin-like machines, so all of them have a really high natural physical resistance. The first is the Ruin Scout. The Ruin Scout is very simple. There's only one attack that you need to be aware of, which is when it tilts its head to face you and before charging with a headbutt attack, its core is exposed. And then simply doing an attack to its face will interrupt this attack and hit its core. When you hit its core twice, it becomes paralyzed for about 15 seconds. Again, this isn't affecting the damage it does, but it will stop it attacking. The Ruin Grader works in a similar way in which its eye and its ankles are its core. When they're glowing, they can be attacked to interrupt the Ruin Grader's attack, and hitting the same weak point twice will disable that weak point for about 20 seconds, and will stop it from being able to perform certain attacks. If both weak points are disabled, it will take a seat and become paralyzed until it's able to reactivate one of its weak points. The other attack to be wary of is if you're too far away from the Ruin Grader, it will charge you, and it won't stop charging until it's finished its animation. This is really annoying to deal with because you'll have to chase it down, so try to position yourself near the Ruin Grader and near where it's about to spawn, and not distance yourself too far. Once you defeated the Ruin Grader, you finally have a boss to fight, which is the Perpetual Mechanical Array, otherwise known as the PMA. There's going to be a lot of acronyms and initializations this. Okay, so the main mechanic of the PMA. When it reaches between 35 and 30% HP, or after a set amount of time, it will start its transformation animation where it splits apart and becomes immune to damage. But on top of that, you can't even damage it beyond 30% HP until you've completed this main mechanic. So if you do manage to get it down to 30% HP very quickly, use the time before it transforms and before it's immune to get some particles from it. But don't waste abilities on it because it's immune. And then as soon as it's got its shield up, then you won't even be able to hit it with abilities to get particles. We'll then proceed to split up into 4 Ruin machines, one of each type. While you can disable each one by hitting their cores, you only need to defeat one of them to end this fate and cause all the others to be defeated. You can identify this one by spotting the Ruin machine that's got the golden ring of glowing runes around it. The one that's picked is also really random. Some are easier to defeat than others. For example, the crab and the jellyfish both have more health than the other two. So because this is the first chamber, if you want to reset to try and get one of the weaker enemies with the ring on them, do it. After you defeat said Ruin machine, the PMA's core will no longer be immune, and during this time it's paralyzed and has all of its resistances reduced by 50%. You have about 20 seconds to make the most of this before the cycle starts again. Oh, another note about the 4 summoned Ruin machines, try not to waste all of your big damage abilities on instantly killing one of the summoned Ruin machines that has a golden ring around it. If you do this, you won't have all of your damage saved up to do damage to the actual PMA while it has its weakened core. After smashing apart that robot, we're on to another robot. This time we're fighting a Simon, otherwise known as the Algorithm of Semi-Intransient Matrix of Overseer Network. While this is a robot, this kind of has the same conditions as the Terrashroom for what's suggested to take for it, as you should take Electro for the mechanic and maybe a Dendro character if you want to do the mechanic even quicker. This is because soon into combat, a Simon will enter an invisible state while summoning 4 mechanical parts in its place. During this time, a Simon has a huge increase to the amount of resistance they have, going from 10% to 210%, and it will only lose this resistance when it loses its invisibility. There's 3 ways for it to exit. You can wait a significant amount of time, so try to do as much damage while it's invisible, but as it has really high resistances, it's not recommended to do this. There's 2 other ways to get it to exit out of invisibility. The fastest being just to apply a catalyze reaction directly to it. So any amount of Electro and Dendro applied to it while it's in this state will break it out of its invisibility. The final way is to destroy one of the parts that was summoned when it went invisible. Breaking a part will cause a Simon to try and repair the part while invisible, and one of these repair parts self-infuses with Dendro, and you simply need to apply Electro to that part itself to trigger a catalyze reaction, and that removes the invisibility. This will take you a little bit longer, but you're still completing the mechanic a lot sooner than having to wait around for it. All the parts can simply be broke by damaging them with any kind of damage, and they actually drop energy orbs when defeated, so if you need more energy, you can defeat them for it. Either of those last 2 options, triggering a reaction on it, will cause it to instantly exit out of invisibility and become paralyzed for around 15 seconds, losing all of those resistances. Something to keep in mind is if you're either just ignoring its invisibility or you're trying to apply the elements directly to it to instantly make it exit out of invisibility, you need to know where it is, and it can be quite difficult to spot. There's a couple of useful ways of revealing it. You can debuff it. Something like Zhongli's shield will cause its resistances to go down, and while its resistances are down, it has these little downward arrow icons on it. If there's already an element applied to it or a reaction applied to it, it can show that reaction effect. Or simply, some characters like Lisa or Nahida put marks on enemies, and these marks will show up even if the enemy's invisible. Okay, 2 regional robot bosses down, 1 left to go. Let's take a look at Chamber 3. Again, Chamber 3 is very single target. For side 1 specifically, you want to probably not take Pyro because multiple of the enemies here have really high Pyro resistance, so don't rely on it as your main source of damage. There's also again here enemies with Pyro elemental wards, so bring Hydra or Electro or whatever you want to deal with that. On top of that, the enemy with the ward can make it quite annoying to hit their ward, so characters that have large area of application abilities will be more important than others, but I'll go more over that later. Firstly, let's look at the first 2 enemies you're facing, which are the Eremite Desert Clearwater and the Eremite Sunfrost, so the Cryo and the Hydra Eremites. Again, these are human factions, so they have lower physical resistance, and we face them in Last Abyss. So just like before, once they reach 70% HP, they'll infuse their weapons and have higher interruption resistance, and have more deadly attack. But after doing 3 enhanced attacks, they will exhaust themselves, making themselves more vulnerable. At this point, they lose 60% resistance to the element that they are. So if they're Hydra-infused weapons, they have really low Hydra resistance. But like usual, you'll probably defeat them before they get to this stage. Oh, and just like Last Abyss, they can also react off you, so if one applies Hydra, one applies Cryo, it will freeze you, and that can be quite annoying, so be wary of that. Next is the Fiery Blob, the Fluid Avatar of Lava. Fluid Avatar of Lava has really high Pyro resistance, all the way up to 70%, and it constantly has a Pyro aura. That means some good things, some bad things. Firstly, Hydra or Cryo characters can get free reactions of it to amplify their damage, so you'll get free melts or vaporizers off it. You can also get free overloads off it if you need those. But on the other hand, because it has a constant Pyro aura, it'll be quite difficult to trigger some reactions. So you couldn't trigger Electrocharged on Auron because Hydra and Pyro cannot coexist on an enemy. You couldn't trigger a non-Pyro Geo reaction on Jillinan for her scroll set because she's always going to be creating a Pyro Crystallize. And the last enemy you'll face in this chamber is the Emperor of Fire and Iron, or the big fiery crab guy from Fontaine. Just like the Avatar of Lava, this has naturally higher Pyro resistance all the way to 60%. As soon as the battle starts, the Emperor will infuse the 2 molten horns on its head with Pyro wards. Doing this causes all of its resistances to be increased by 80%. So it's quite important you either bring Resistance Shred or you break its wards in some way. The wards themselves consist of 16 units of Pyro each, which isn't a lot, but they're annoying to hit. It's pretty difficult to apply elements to the horns. Hitting it in the face with attacks just won't count, though I did find I could attack from above rather well. The most consistent way I've found to hit the horns is with a large hitbox. So something like Nervlet's charge tag, Kokomi's or Barbara's charge tag, activations of Raiden's skill, anything that affects a really big area. This is somewhat arbitrary and difficult to find out, so my best recommendation would be test it in the overworld if you're not sure. The other time you'll be able to hit the horns really easily is any times it kind of submerges itself. Whether it jumps towards you and sinks a little bit into the arena, or it buries itself to do some more deadly attacks. Lastly, it will try to regenerate the wards on its horns about every 20 seconds. After the horns are destroyed though, it will lose its resistances and be paralyzed for around 6 seconds. And on top of that, while the horns aren't infused, it will just do less damage with its attacks. And lastly, probably the reason you came to this guide, Side 2. We're fighting a boss that many of you may have never fought before, the Secret Source Automaton Configuration Device, or SAC. That doesn't really work. We'll just stick to Automaton. So it's single target, Night Soul will be helpful against this thing, and you need a way to deal with its main mechanic, which I'll explain later. So first of all, the Automaton has really high natural resistances. You know how in the previous chamber, the Emperor of Fire and Iron had 60% resistance to Pyro? This has 60% resistance to everything. So taking Resistance Shred is pretty helpful. You can only get it to lose those resistances after completing its main mechanic, which will happen after about 2 to 3 attacks or after about 30 to 40 seconds. So if you have Night Soul on your team and your characters exist while being in the Night Soul Blessing state, even if they're off field, it will fill up the Adaptive Countermeasures meter. This is the little ring by its name. After this meter is filled up, it will cause it to trigger the main mechanic. And so if you have a lot of Night Soul characters on your team, you can reduce the time to get to this mechanic by up to 20 seconds. Having multiple characters in Night Soul will charge this even faster, but there won't be a big difference between 1 and 4 Natlan units, as long as you can spend 14 seconds at least in Night Soul, which which is enough to fill up the bar. Someone like PMC can only do this for 13 seconds, so you'll always need 2 skills. This means it's quite slow to do for them and isn't necessarily a benefit. It doesn't matter where you are in the chamber though, you don't need to be near it to get this meter to fill up while you're in Night Soul. You can be at the edge and it will still count. If you do fill up the Night Soul meter, it will always perform an attack beforehand where it moves to the side and draws 2 sets of parallel lines. You can use those lines to predict where the pillars are going to spawn, as they always spawn at the 2 corners towards the center of the arena from the boss. If the automaton is just about to finish an attack though, and you fill up the adaptive countermeasures meter, it will also then perform the parallel line attack, delaying the mechanic even further. So be fast with Night Soul or wait, but don't do both. If you're on your 3rd attack and then you fill up the AC meter, it will take even longer. So looking at the mechanic, during the mechanic, the automaton will move over to one side of the arena, and then towards the center of the arena, adjacent to it, it will summon 2 phlogiston pillars, with a core at the top of each. On top of that, each core has a barrier about the size of the pillar summoned around it, meaning you can't use ranged attacks to destroy the cores, and so the only way of breaking them is by ascending the pillars and being next to them. I'm going to put up a quick tier list now to kind of give you an idea of which characters are competent at climbing it and which aren't, but I've also made a longer video going through every character on this list showing how I climbed up with them. I'll put a link in the description, but I'll also cover the most difficult ones to do here, because you can climb the pillars with almost any character. You just need to know the right ledge to grab. So you can do this with tall male characters. Tall male characters just need to grab this ledge by this slanted part. It doesn't matter which tall male model, they all should be able to do it. The same also applies to medium male characters. It's a slightly different ledge. You look for this arch and then you jump for the little sticking out part on the left, and with 2 jumps you get to the top. You use the exact same ledge here for medium females and short females. The only character model I wasn't able to do this with was tall female characters. So if you're running a team of all tall female characters and you're including no characters with any mobility abilities, I'm not even sure what that team would look like, then you will really struggle with this, and I don't recommend doing that. If you do the Night Soul mechanic and get those 2 parallel purple lines drawn, you can also know exactly where the pillars are going to spawn. For some like Zhongli, Venti, or Albedo, you can use their abilities to climb exactly where the pillar is going to be, so as soon as it spawns, you're right on top of the node. Unfortunately, you do need to be a certain height to get pushed up. I tried with Chaska and it worked, but I tried jumping, and being halfway up Zhongli's pillar just shoots you to the side. While you are doing this mechanic, there will be 2 lasers trying to shoot you, and they do quite a lot of damage. If you're trying to do the model-specific ledge jump, it can be quite dangerous because it might take you a few attempts to get up there, and the lasers do a lot of damage while you're on the ground. Luckily, once you're in the air in any way, whether that's flying with Chaska or you're up the pillar, those laser attacks are no longer able to hit you. And from when this mechanic starts, you have about 12 seconds to break both of the cores in time before a large arena-wide attack hits you. While this mech does have a huge HP pool and really high resistances, there's actually a reason why that's not as bad as it seems. That's because as soon as you broke the cores, not only does it lose resistances, reducing them by 90%, so from 60 all the way down to -30, it's paralyzed for 15 seconds so it won't attack, but also it takes 15% damage, and that 15% is 15% of its max HP. If it's under 15% HP, that means this damage instantly defeats it. And after it's recovered from this mechanic, it will start the rotation all over again, so having multiple Natline characters to decrease the time it takes to get to this mechanic can be more significant. That was a lot of information. That's the longest section I've done on the Abyss enemies so far. So while we've still got some time remaining, let's look at teams. As usual, the teams I mention here are absolutely optional, and they're just what I consider to be the most convenient based upon the challenges the Abyss have given us. Play what you like, and if you need more ideas, there's hundreds if not thousands of Abyss clears already out there. Just look them up on YouTube. Also, these teams might not be the best teams. I'm just highlighting characters that make the most of the Abyss blessings and the buffs we've been given. For example, a more weaker team might be able to just wipe the floor with everything because of her big damage. She can do that in most Abysses, but I want to look at characters that shine more than normal in this Abyss in particular. So let's take a look, if we're doing a continuous run, what the problems are, what the restrictions are, and what the recommendations would be. First off, we have the Abyss blessing, which gives us plunge bonus damage, and we have the Leyline disorder, which gives us Hydra elemental skill damage. Now, we've already discussed how the cast of characters that get bonuses from the elemental skill damage is very narrow. Only really Farina and Jincho gain significant gains from this. It's also mainly single target, and all the chambers are multi-wave. Admittedly, there's only 3 enemies max, but it's still multi-wave. You don't want to rely on Geo as in the first chamber, but that's only 1 enemy out of all the enemies this side. You'd like to bring Osea, Numa, Blunt Damage, or Geo to also break that creature's ward. You want to bring Hydro, Electro, Animo, or some way of breaking the Pyrolector's ward, and the same goes Pyro, Dendro, Cryo, Animo, or something for the Electrolector's ward. You don't want to rely on Pyro damage, as there's a lot of Pyro resistance in the first chamber and the last chamber. Bringing Night Soul damage can be a bonus for the Wyob, but that's the only case that it's needed. We already know we want to break Pyro wards, but there's also the Wyob for that, and later there's the Emperor. The second chamber has really high physical resistances, so just don't bring physical as your main source of damage. And lastly, Hydro or Cryo are nice to take because they get free reactions off the Avatar of Lava. And ideally, if you're taking Hydro application or Electro application, you want it to have a large hitbox so it's easy to deal with the horns of the Emperor. So there's one character in particular that kind of stands out above the rest, and that is, surprisingly, the banner featured character, Farina de Fontaine. While Farina doesn't necessarily benefit from the plunge damage bonus, she's not the active character, so she doesn't need to necessarily worry about that anyway. She's really good in multi-wave and in single target. She helps with the Hydro requirement that we have kind of across the board with these chambers. She's bringing Osea or Numa, so that's useful. But most importantly, she's getting the most out of that Leyline Blessing. 75% damage is a hell of a lot of bonus. So what other characters could you put with Farina to deal with these chambers? Neuvillette and Farina are a classic pairing. Neuvillette is really good at multi-wave because he has very flexible rotations. If you want to say hit the furnace dropped by the Pyrolector and the Electrolector at the same time, you'll be more than okay with that. You're not burst reliant for the Wyob, which is nice. Chamber 3 has an Eremite that makes itself vulnerable to Hydro damage, and the Avatar of Lava will let you get free Vaporizers. You also have a very large hitbox on your special charge attack, so you're able to hit the horns of the Emperor more easily. And almost as importantly as all those factors is you have very flexible teammates. If you want to take Nahida for a Dendro character to help deal with the Electro Shield, you can make a Hyper Bloom team. If you want to take a Cryo character to do the same, you can take Sitlali. If you want more resistance shred for the Emperor, you can take Jillanan. Or say you want to swirl the Lectors on each other, you can take Kazaha for that. And you definitely want more Hydro application than the other element used to deal with the Electrolector this Abyss, just because the Pyro ward is so much bigger and there's so many Pyro wards. Though there is another character that can also act as a driver that kind of fits almost the same things that Neuvillette does, admittedly probably doing a little less damage, which is Kokomi. Kokomi will be great as a driver with Farina in these teams. Kokomi, again, is okay at multi-wave. You can hit multiple targets with her skill because you only need a little bit of application to be able to break that furnace. Her charge tags have a very large hitbox, so that can help you deal with the Emperor. And again, you have quite flexible teammates. You can play her in a mono Hydro team. You can put Kazaha there, you can put Sitlali there, you can put Nahida there and make a Hyper Bloom team. Something that you can't do in Neuvillette teams is put Jincho or Yelan in these teams. Kokomi can use plenty of normal attack, which means with those characters you can break those Pyro wards even faster. If you're looking for something with a bit more Night Soul application, you could use Mualani. Mualani hits for big damage and infrequently, and so most likely you will have slower Hydro application to break the Pyro wards. But with the help of Farina, you should have more than enough. Maybe you just have to do some normal attacks on her. The other condition if you're playing Mualani with Farina is that you'll definitely have to take Xiangling to make sure you have enough Pyro application, which could help with the Electrolector's ward but won't help with much else. But I wouldn't worry because Xiangling isn't normally doing much damage in those teams anyway. You just build her for her Pyro application. You could also take a teammate like Baijo for the Dendro application, for the Electro Shield, and for the healing he brings, on top of being able to get some more burning to help with the Pyro application. We also have Ayato, but I won't go as much in detail on him, but he does apply Hydro as an on-field driver. Lastly, for the Hydro characters, we have the combination of a kind of core with Farina of either Yelan or Jincho, because they can go really well with so many different teammates. You could play a Cryo carry for a more Freeze team, not that Freeze will work against bosses or the Lectors, but it gives you some Cryo application and Cryo damage can still be fine. Hyper Bloom, as we mentioned earlier, will still be a great team because that's very single target orientated and has all the elements that you need to take out the enemy, although Farina won't really be helping with the Hyper Bloom damage, but that's not really too much of a deal breaker. You just kind of play a hybrid. You could slot Noelle or Navia perfectly well with the Hydro core, and there's many other combos you can take. Okay, what about when Farina's solo Hydro? Are there any good elemental pairings there that would work? Well, there's two Anemo characters that would do quite well. You can either run Zhao, because Zhao will actually make the most of the plunge bonus. Anemo, even though you've got a lot of characters characters will probably be slower at breaking the wards, but it's still something to consider. And Chaska can also slot a variety of teammates. So you can get some Hydra in there, some Electro, some Cryo to break those wards, and you're not often in multi-target, so that's not as much of an issue for Chaska. The only thing to keep in mind for her is that often you like Vaporize or Melt because that's your highest damage teams, so something a bit more super orientated without Pyro isn't going to be as great. Okay, what about without Farina? Well, we have the characters we mentioned earlier for the cores, which were Yalanj and Chol. You can run them together or separately, and all their Hydra application is really useful for the enemies you'll be facing. Jinchol himself, his skill does do quite a lot of damage if you manage to vape it. The condition for that is that you have to bring Pyro along, but I'm sure there's certainly teams where you'll be able to make good use of it. We also already mentioned a few times that Hyper Bloom should be great for this Abyss, whether you're using one or multiple Hydra characters. Aggravate should also technically work. It will be slower to break those Pyro shields because you'll only be applying Electro, but you should still be able to do it perfectly fine. You can use Varessa, you can use Chlorand, I'm sure there's lots of options. You could do an Overload team, but the one condition for the Overload team is that you don't want to rely on your Pyro damage. One, because there's a lot of Pyro resistance, but also if you're relying on Pyro damage, you're not going to have as much Electro application as you might need to break those shields. Normally I say, oh, it's single target, don't bring Nilou. But there are good single target Nilou teams. For example, something like Alhaitham, Jinchol Nilou. Then you get to bring Dendro and you get to bring Hydro, so you're good at dealing with the shield, and you have a good amount of single target damage with those characters. Lastly, I'm sure there's variations of Taser or something with an Animo driver that might work, but I didn't look too much into these. That's probably the more complicated side, but let's take a look at side 2 now. What kind of teams would I recommend? So this side has a lot more concentrated buffing on plunging. Not only do you get the shockwaves, but you also get plunge damage bonus of 75%. It's mainly single target, and you don't want to take Dendro as your main source of damage probably. So would really like some Electro for the mechanics in the first and the second chamber, and if you want to make those chambers even faster, both recommend bringing Dendro alongside the Electro so you can trigger catalyze reactions. You'd also quite like some Night Soul for the last chamber, and you absolutely need a way to deal with the mechanic of the automaton, although that's quite broad as we went over earlier. So what characters would I recommend? Surprise, surprise, Varessa is going to be very good at this. Varessa is a plunge-orientated character who applies Electro and is in Night Soul, so she kind of works for everything on this side. All the buffs, all the damage boosts they give you, she can make use of them. Whether that's in an Aggravate team where you're also bringing someone like Nahida, whether you're bringing just Farina for the damage buffs, or maybe you're taking Chevreuse for an Overload team. But keep in mind, if you are bringing Overload, you're kind of bricking the mechanic of the first chamber because any Pyro application is going to reduce that meter by a lot. You're not going to be able to get the Terror Shroom in an activated state and reduce its resistances. Okay, what other characters will work? Well, Zhao will also work. The one condition for Zhao is that you'll probably need a character like Ian-san with him. Maybe you could run Fischl, but Ian-san is going to do significantly more for Zhao. You will need a lot of energy on her, but you can run her on Noblesse. She'll be able to buff up his attack and make him a great character for doing these chambers. You can make use of all of the plunge buffs, and you can do those Electro checks. Zhao can climb the tower, Ian-san can provide Night Soul, so you're all set. And the same really goes for Garming. Garming can use Ian-san in the exact same way to get all those benefits and plunge for a lot of damage. One character that you can't do that with, though, is Diluc. Diluc needs Farina and Xianyun and Bennett, and so there's no space for an Electro character to slot in there. But realistically, if you're not making use of the plunge buff, if you slot either Oron or Ian-san into any team, they should be great and be able to get you through all of the mechanics of all those chambers. Even on top of that, Night Soul is not absolutely necessary for that last chamber, so you could take a Hyper Bloom team, because Hyper Bloom is very single target. That will be harder for the first chamber, but it should still work, because remember, it's only the Terror Shroom that has high resistances. The Eremite beforehand has lower resistances to Dendro. Aggravate teams will also work really well, whether that's Sethos or Chlorand, as long as you're confident with the way that you want to get up the pillars for the automaton. And so really any team with Electro works, whether that's Overload, even though it harms the first chamber, Taser, you could play Mono Electro kind of thing, or at least Hyper Raiden. One other character that I often forget to mention in these sections that will also work for this, which is Chaska. You give her some Electro on your team and you're able to complete the mechanics. Chaska again is Night Soul orientated, it's all single target, she should be good to go. Wow, I think that's everything. I think I covered most things. This was meant to be a preliminary guide. I don't know how I'm going to make a second one later. Maybe I'll make it shorter and just do some testing, but I hope you enjoyed yourselves. I hope that helped, and I hope if you got 36 stars with that, or just wanted to leave a message, feel free to. I tried to respond to everyone that ends up in the comment section. If you enjoy that, want to catch this next time, subscribe, no pressure. If you've got any more questions, again, feel free to put them in the comments. You can also ask in my Discord or my inactive Twitch where I stream on about once every 3 months. But that should be everything. Bye-bye.